それでは時間となりましたので、セミナーを開始いたします。本日、座長を務めますのは、九州大学アジア・オセアニア研究教育機構、田中俊則准教授です。田中先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、ありがとうございます。皆様、こんにちは。本日は第195回のブランバックセミナーにようこそお越しくださいました。今年はですね、早々に梅雨も明けてですね、暑い日が続いておりますが、皆様、いかがお過ごしでしょうか。本日はですね、九州大学法学研究院国際関係学部門のマーク・フェニック教授にお越しいただいております。お話しいただくテーマはデータ正義、ビジネス中心から人間中心のアプローチへです。ブランバックセミナーもですね、今年で5年目となり、これまで多くの先生にお話をいただきましたが、法学部の先生にお話しいただくのは珍しいことですので、とても楽しみにしております。私もですね、最初の就職先が、法学部だったのでですね、懐かしく思い出すことです。なお、先ほどアナウンスもありましたが、本日のご講演は英語で行われますので、この画面のですね、下の方にある通訳ボタンを押して、日本語を選択いただければと思います。ご講演いただく前に、フェニック先生のご略歴をご紹介いたします。フェニック先生はイギリスのリーズご出身です。ご専門は国際ビジネス法で、主な研究分野はデジタル時代におけるビジネスの規制、また法と社会の理論です。著書や編著書は20冊以上、論文は50本以上と非常に多くの業績を残されています。フェニック先生はケンブリッジ大学で修士号と博士号を取得され、これまでに香港大学、シンガポール国立大学などでも客員教授を務められるなど、世界で活躍をされています。先ほど話していたらですね、福岡に30年ほど今住まれていて、福岡がですね、世界でも一番住みやすいというふうにご友人にもお話しされているそうです。それでは、マーク・フェニック先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
先生、ミュートになってます。
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the kind introduction and the opportunity to speak with you today. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining the seminar, because everyone's obviously very busy at this time of year. So thank you for participating. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm currently writing a book which has this title, Data Justice. And while it's still a work in progress, I'm still writing the book, I'd like to share some of the ideas with you today, some of the key ideas of the book and why I think this project is important. I have two co-authors who I'm writing the book with, and I'll introduce them on a later slide. Okay. First of all, I'd like to start with a little bit of background. And this first point is perhaps obvious to everyone, but we live in a world that is increasingly sort of shaped and influenced by personal data. Every time we use a phone, we wear a smartwatch, we browse the web, we walk around on the streets, personal data is being collected about us, and that data is then being aggregated, analyzed, and used in various ways by the companies that collect and control that data. And many of you have probably heard this expression, data is the new oil, which I quite like this metaphor. First coined in 2006 by a British mathematician, and which later featured on the cover of The Economist. You can see on the right-hand side, data is the world's most valuable resource. The world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, but data. And I think this metaphor captures something essential about data, which is often forgotten, that like oil, data needs to be refined through a process of kind of aggregation and analysis. and data is aggregated, it's analyzed, and then the data yields insights, inferences, and predictions that can be leveraged by companies for profit. I guess the thought is that, in other words, that data has a kind of life cycle, and that's an important idea that I'll come back to. So the first point I just want to make is the centrality of data in the modern economy, which is obvious, and this second thought about the character of data as a resource. It has a life cycle. It needs refining in a way that makes the metaphor of oil appropriate. The second bit of background is that over the past 25 years, personal data has become, on the one hand, it's become central to the modern digital economy, but as its importance has grown, trust in technology companies has steadily declined. Yeah. Now, we live in a world where declining trust in institutions is a sort of feature of the world. All institutions everywhere seem to be experiencing some sort of declining trust. But there is strong empirical evidence that trust in technology companies in particular is declining faster than trust in other institutions. And on the right hand, you can see evidence that loss in confidence in Facebook, for example, is far greater than loss in trust in other sorts of institutions, such as banks, police, or even politicians. And one of the reasons for this declining trust in technology companies is this mistrust over how companies, especially large companies like Facebook, Amazon, how they handle our personal data. And I think as a consequence of this, the whole question of data governance is now one of the most urgent kind of social, legal, and political challenges of our time. Now, if we look around the world, we can see many companies have quite sophisticated data protection and privacy laws. Perhaps the two most well-known examples are the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation and the California Consumer Privacy Act. But I think the sort of starting point of our book is that despite their scope and ambition, these laws are failing to protect individuals. And I think the first problem with these laws is that is connected to one of the central features of these laws, which is the idea of consent. Many of these laws are built around the idea of consent. And the problem is that consent is often an illusion. It's a mirage. Legal compliance will often depend from a company's point of view on whether the users of a particular service or product have consented to data collection, whether they click on a sort of I agree box. And the idea of consent is absolutely central to modern data protection law. But in reality, this typically creates an impossible choice for end users. Either we accept terms and conditions that we don't understand, or more typically that we simply haven't read, or we refuse to consent and we're denied access to important products and services. So we're given this sort of impossible choice, or this unpleasant choice of either consenting to something we don't fully understand or not accessing the service, which denies us opportunity. So consent has become a kind of empty ritual. And in practice, I think that's true of much consent in the modern world. I mean, ask yourself, when was the last time you read a privacy policy all the way through? Most lawyers, most privacy lawyers, most data protection lawyers don't even do that. So it somehow reveals this idea that privacy, consent in a privacy context is broken. But I think the privacy, but I think more than that, the problems with consent are more serious than that. Modern data protection laws and privacy laws typically focus on the moment of data collection. We're required to give our consent at the point of time where the data is collected. However, the moment of data collection is not really the right moment to decide whether to give our consent. Privacy risks often emerge later when the data is sort of bunched together and analysed, sold, shared and repurposed in ways that we can't foresee at the point of collection when we're required to give our consent. So we're being asked to make decisions about consent in situations where meaningful understanding is impossible and the long-term consequences of our decision are unclear and unknowable. So that's the kind of background to our book. That the last point on the slide, data protection law is still too enterprise-centric. It still too focused on the interests of business, and we need to shift to a more, what we call in our book, a more human-centric approach. And I think these questions about the limits of data protection law have become even more complicated with the rise of artificial intelligence. And we're clearly entering a new phase in the digital transformation in which artificial intelligence is playing an even more important role. And I recently published an article with various people from various disciplines on so-called agentic systems, AI agents. And these are artificial intelligence systems that operate with a high degree of autonomy and agency and perform various tasks for us in our private lives or in our professional lives. And one of the crucial features of these agentic AI systems is that they're capable of learning, adapting and sort of more proactively than earlier technologies of taking the initiative on our behalf. So the capacity of these systems to learn, to adapt and to take the initiative makes them quite a sort of distinctive and new form of stage or a new phase in the digital revolution. And these agentic systems also conflict with some of the underlying assumptions and ideas of existing data protection law. Another central idea in data protection law is the principle of what's called purpose limitation. Personal data, which is collected for one purpose, can't be used for another person without additional consent. So if a hospital gathers patient data to provide care, for instance, it can't turn around and use that data to sell insurance unless the patient explicitly agrees to the use of that data for the new purpose. But I think there are two problems or two additional problems as we enter a world of AI agents and AI agentic systems. We're going to encounter two new problems with data protection law. First of all, this agentic AI has no often it may start off with a fixed purpose, but that purpose evolves as the AI develops and operates. So an AI agent might start off by making decisions regarding patients in a healthcare context, but then it might pursue a sort of secondary goal that was never deployed, that was never anticipated at deployment by even the creators of that system. The ability to find novel uses for data, so the ability to find novel uses for data, which is seen as a strength of AI agentic systems, from a privacy law perspective, can look like a bug because as the system evolves new purposes, this idea of purpose limitation is somehow disconnected from the reality of the operation of the system. And the sort of second related problem is that as AI agents are constantly repurposing the data, they're using the data for new purposes. So, and this again is by design. By design, the AI agents keep changing their use of information. And that sort of blurs the line, the distinction between the initial purpose and the secondary purpose becomes very hard to distinguish and discern. And these sorts of purpose limitation rules, you can only use the data for the initially stated purpose. These sorts of data minimization rules, they struggle when AI is constantly pulling in more data and striving to improve itself. So again, we have this kind of disconnect between the idea of purpose limitation and the idea of the kind of evolving nature of AI systems. So in short, agentic AI treats data as a fluid resource to exploit for optimal outcomes, whereas data privacy law treats data as something which is fixed and borrowed for a sort of specific pre-agreed use. So we have a sort of a whole new area of problems emerging with modern data privacy law in the context of autonomous AI systems. I'll to save a bit of time and to give myself some more time at the end, I'll do this slide quickly. If we look around the world at sort of policymakers, lawmakers and researchers who write about this sort of stuff, I think broadly speaking, we can see four sort of dominant responses to the challenges of digital technologies and the challenges of AI. And these four responses, the basic idea of our book is that all of these four responses seem to be flawed. I don't have time to explain each of the four responses, and I don't have time to describe how each of the four responses are flawed, but I think most of the existing discussion around data protection, privacy, and digital technologies, especially evolving digital technologies, they seem to be flawed in various ways. And I hope I've left very quickly, we have the doomsayers who say this technology is a sort of a genuine threat which must be sort of stopped. We have regulators who say, well, we need to slow the progress. We need to build on existing laws, consent-based laws, purpose limitation style laws. We have the techno-authoritarians who see that this law opens up new possibilities for social control. So it's a kind of an instrument of social control. And we have the accelerationists who think that, well, what we should do is somehow we should free up this technology and let it develop as quickly as possible. And we shouldn't get too hung up about concerns about the dangers of new technologies to either humanity in some general sense or dangers in terms of privacy of individuals. So all four of these responses seem flawed. And what we're interested in doing in our book is developing an alternative vision of the future. These are my two co-authors. Michael Furtick is quite a well-known privacy advocate. He's written a lot about privacy. He's not an academic, he's an entrepreneur. Now he runs a venture capitalist fund. And my second co-author is a Silicon Valley lawyer who's a co-founder of an AI company. And the book we're trying to write, perhaps it's obvious from my co-authors, we're not trying to write an academic book. We're trying to write a book which is more, how can we call it, popular non-fiction, a sort of a book that's the kind of book that you read in an airport. And I think that kind of what we hope to do is to trigger kind of more discussion about these issues. Okay, which brings us to the content of the book. what are the main arguments that we are making. And I think I've got time to introduce some of the main arguments that we are proposing. Our shared sort of starting point is probably clear from what I've said already. We need a more human-centric approach to data governance. It's time to rethink our relationship with technology. We need, if you like, a new social contract with technology that empowers the individual and creates trust in technology and in the technology companies that control the technology. And at the heart of our argument is a principle that we call private by default. And this marks a sort of fundamental shift from today's enterprise-centric, business-centric data economy, where data is sort of taken and hidden behind layers of empty consent and controlled by technology companies. In contrast, a private by default model treats personal data as something that belongs to the individual. My data is mine, it's my property. And access to that data must be actively granted and not passively consented to. And companies should have to actively justify why they need access to our data, and individuals should remain in control of their data from the initial collection of that data throughout the life cycle of that data. Privacy becomes the sort of genuine baseline across the life cycle of data and not some sort of afterthought or secondary effect. And broadly speaking, we have three main arguments in favor of this approach, of this idea that my data is my property, my data is mine. And if the first argument is what I would call a thought experiment. If we were starting again, if we were starting the digital revolution again, if we were designing a new data ecosystem and rules for data governance from scratch, I think most people would agree that we wouldn't choose the rules and systems that we have today. But the thought experiment would be to ask, if we were starting over again, what sort of data ecosystem, what sort of rules and principles would we be seeking to design? And the starting point of the first argument is that given that sort of thought experiment, we think most people would opt for principles that are closer to ideas of private by default, rather than a system built around ideas like consent and purpose limitation. And this type of thought experiment is often used by political philosophers. John Rawls very famously used this sort of thought experiment in imagining the principles of justice in the context of political philosophy. And I think this type of thought experiment, if we were starting again, if we were designing our data governance rules from scratch, what sort of principles would we agree to? What would be the principles of data justice that we would agree to? The second idea is perhaps a rather difficult concept, but we call it expressive autonomy. Everyone recognizes that our data is valuable because it reflects who we are. Our data is, in some sense, it doesn't just reflect who we are in a digital society. Our data is who we are. And data and control over our data seems important to people. Our data is not just a sort of trail of clicks and transactions. Our data is, in a sense, us. My data is me. My data is me. It's central to my identity. And if data is central to my identity, controlling that data becomes essential to my freedom and my ability to express myself as an individual. And so in the same way we protect free speech and thought, we should protect digital identities and digital presences and give everyone much greater rights and controls over their data. And the third thought in justifying this model is that clearly the market in data is broken. We have a kind of market failure. And what I mean by that is, I think, very obvious, that we live in a world where a handful of powerful firms dominate the global data economy. And the kind of concentration of power undermines trust. It stifles competition, it prevents competition, and increasingly, and we can see this, it distorts our political processes and distorts democracy. So questions of data governance sort of seep out. This issue of data governance is more than about privacy and data protection. It impacts the whole economy. It impacts our increasingly, and we can see this, I can give you examples in the discussion, it increasingly impacts our political processes. So breaking up data monopolies and supporting sort of technologies that can somehow, smaller startup companies, new companies, and promoting competition seems important to fix the market failure that we can see in many worlds, many places. So, and these sorts of ideas come together. Let me sort of summarize the basic idea of the book then around what we might think of as the three pillars of data justice. We have, on the first idea, we have individual empowerment. We need to give individuals power and control over their data. That's this idea of private by default. Secondly, and I don't have time to talk about this, and this is not really my expertise, my co-authors are more experts on this. We need to have a sort of new technological infrastructure that facilitates this kind of personal control over data. We need to encourage technologies that enable more human-centric, private by default systems. And lastly, we need to break up the big platforms. We need to do something to correct the market failure in the economy. Let me conclude very quickly with a couple of final thoughts. The first thought is this isn't just about privacy and data protection. It's about the kind of digital future, the kind of digital society of the future that we want to build. Clearly, at the moment, there is an imbalance in the distribution of power. A sort of business-centric approach rather than a human-centric approach, and we need to fix that. Or our argument is we need to fix that. And just to end with two final thoughts. Whenever I give this talk, I feel that it probably comes across as a little utopian or slightly naive. And I think we know that. We know that the kind of arguments we're making here are sort of utopian and possibly naive. But I think we also believe that we need to have different radical perspectives and voices because this issue is so important and it affects everyone. And the second concluding thought is, I hope it doesn't come across what I'm saying as anti-technology. My co-authors and I are definitely not anti-technology, but I think what we're suggesting is we need a more human-centric approach that can build greater trust in technology and technology companies. And to do that, we need a kind of interdisciplinary conversation involving technologists, lawyers, political scientists, policymakers, and the business community about the best way to do that. And it's only through that kind of public interdisciplinary discourse that we can build a better, future for the kinds of digital technologies that affect all of our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Fenwick. It was very, very exciting, and I thought it's very important presentation. It is very relevant in this age, and I fully agree with your talk and recommendation. It was very important. I fully agree. So thank you very much again. And as I said, the most participants are Japanese. So excuse me, I'm going to speak a little bit in Japanese, and maybe it's going to be a mixture.
Yes,
はい、ありがとうございました。大変時期に見合った素晴らしいご講演だったと思います。はい。ここか今ですね、通訳ボタンのところにですね、じゃあチャットボックスにですね、質問があればですね、質問を入れていただければと思います。はい。So before, since there'll be several minutes that they put in the chat box for the questions, I want to start several questions from my side in English, basically. Several information was very interesting. And if you could show, could you go to the slide of the, maybe third slide, which shows a declining trust in new technologies. You had a figure with a loss in mean confidence. Yes, this one. Yes. So I thought this figure is very interesting, but especially college sit on the 4th rank that has the least trust. Professor, you are muted.
Yes. Gosh, I hadn't even noticed. Isn't that interesting? I hadn't even noticed that myself.
Yes. And the Congress, it
Yes.
seems that the Congress is most somehow trusted.
Or the
But
yes.
in Japan, this will be totally opposite somehow. So I just wondered the data source. Oh, what's the data source for this figure?
Gosh, I would need, sorry, I did have it written down somewhere. I would have to, but okay. I can't remember the precise data source. Yeah, that's terrible, but I did have it written down. But this is a large scale, this is a large public survey by a sort of independent data organization. So it is a kind of reputable study. And we also have some other data that's perhaps doesn't support the precise ranking of institutions, but certainly does support the basic premise, which is that mistrust is declining more in technology companies than other companies.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I understand. Can you show the figure again, if it's possible?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes.
So just a quick clarification that this figure, it is the participants to the questionnaire is the whole US or the specific
Yes, all US.
state? All US.
Yes, this is. It was just yes, that's right. This is purely in the US. This is a purely US study, but we do have data for other parts of the world as well. But I just put this there because I think it's okay. Let me put it like this: it's most striking in the US, and perhaps given that we're talking about US companies, that's perhaps the most sort of vivid example of this phenomenon.
Thank you very much. Anyway, it's a big cultural difference that the US doesn't believe in Congress and why Japanese.
No, that's a very interesting thought. And also in the UK, I suspect in the UK probably would be closer to Japan as well. And yeah. But I do think this kind of general decline in trust is the sort of broader context within which all of us live, that institutions, there is a kind of sort of declining trust in all of the institutions, and that there are kind of, I don't know, the sort of negative synergies between the declining trust in institutions.
Thank you very much. Now we have 2 questions, so let me go ahead with that. The first one is, what do you think about the e-government nowadays? You know, we have many e-government systems. What do you think about that?
Yeah, gosh, I think perhaps that's beyond my expertise, but it's an extremely interesting question. The only thing I would say is that it seems to me, and this, from what you're saying, this seems to be true in Japan, but certainly in the UK, our political processes are breaking. And clearly that's connected, in large part, to social media. That seems very obvious. Let me give you an example. Brexit, my country made the decision to leave the EU. And that was a catastrophic mistake. And yet, even smart people, my father, who's a kind of smart person, even my father voted for Brexit. And why? Because our political discourse is clearly broken, and a large part of the responsibility for the breaking down of our political discourse and our political process is digital technologies. So whilst I think e-government might represent part of the solution to that problem, I think there are much more fundamental problems with politics and political decision making and policy making in Japan, in the UK, clearly in the United States as well. So I think e-government is interesting. And I know a lot of people believe in that, but I think one perhaps should think more broadly about the breakdown of our politics more generally, because that seems to me a sort of a democratic politics. Let's put it.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting, because I saw a British movie called I Am William Blake.
Yes,
which is a fantastic movie, but I think that's part of the, what you're talking.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a huge problem. And I think the world, all these problems are somehow interconnected, but the question of politics, and that then connects to kind of questions of social exclusion and social people feeling disconnected and disempowered from society, and the kind of politics that then creates. And I think Japan at the moment, you don't seem to have the kind of the full consequences don't seem to have, but Brexit and the United States with someone like President Trump, we have a new style of, in Italy, for example, we have this very different style of politics. Yes,
that's very true. So we have another question.
Yes,
that is okay. That's both in English and Japanese written here.
Yes.
Why has trust in AI or technology companies declined so rapidly in recent years? If companies promise to protect everyone's personal data, they can increase trust in AI or new technology. Other factors do you think contribute to increased trust?
No, I don't have an answer, but I would just like to say I very much like the last part of the question. What factors contribute to increased trust? How do we build trust? What is the basis of trust in not in a sort of interpersonal context, but in the context of modern institutions and I don't have an answer to that, but I absolutely think that is the kind of one of the biggest question every society in the world is facing. How do we reconstruct broken trust? And I guess we all know that from personal relationships, when trust breaks down in personal context, it's very difficult to reconstruct trust. And I suspect the same is true in an institutional context. So I don't have an answer to that question, but I would just like to emphasize, for me, that's a wonderful question. How do we reconstruct trust when it's broken? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in the world today, especially given the kind of the sort of cultural mood of skepticism and mistrust that we find everywhere. So that's not an answer, but I think that's a beautiful question. The other part, why is, again, I perhaps this is just repeating what I said, but I do think a lot of the mistrust of technology is due to the fact of the kind of on the one hand, the misuse of data that just becomes so everyone has some sort of story about the misuse of their data by some online or technology company. So when misuse of personal data is ubiquitous, when it's happening constantly and all the time, mistrust is an inevitable consequence of that on the one hand. And I think on the other hand, it's connected to the power that the platform companies have. The concentrations of power scares people. And quite frankly, mistrust is a consequence of those two things.
Yeah. The power is huge.
Greater than many nations. I mean, people often
Exactly.
say,
Exactly. Yeah.
Sure, that's accurate when people say that, but it does seem clear, doesn't it, that we, for the first time in human history, we have private entities,
Right. Exactly.
whose power rivals that of the nation.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a unique moment in human history that, quite frankly, is alarming and I think scares everyone.
I understand now that many governments are going to make a regulation for the use of social networks for their kids.
Yeah, and again, I'm not sure. Yeah, you see that it's we had a Dutch professor visiting us last week from the Netherlands, and he was telling us about that in the context of the Netherlands. I know Australia has tried to do that. Personally, I'm not sure that's the answer. I perhaps this is naive, but I think the solution is more through literacy, somehow educating people in the responsible use of these technologies rather than somehow keeping them away from it. I'm not sure that's the solution, but again, that may just be naive on my part.
So now we have two final questions. For short questions. One is thank you for your very interesting talk. Very impressed. Very well balanced discussion. So first short question is he is interested in the private by default point. So if this were to be implemented, what kind of data collection method will be taken? Would it ultimately lead to make consents more frequently?
Yes, I think that's right. I think in a sense that is the obvious consequence of this. If I'm in control of my data, there is going to be a greater responsibility is going to fall on me to make constant decisions about that use of data. Clearly, that's right. And that not everyone may want to do that, and because it's going to increase the sort of transaction costs of participating in the digital economy, and that's true. But I think the trade-off that we're making is that that kind of those transaction costs, what we're getting in exchange for that, is kind of dominion and control over our data. And it seems to me we can't have both those. We have to somehow accept that as the price we pay for control and empowerment. We can't have it both ways. Or perhaps AI, some sort of, that's what my co-author, I know he's a very strong advocate of AI. Agentic AI may be able to perform many of the functions that is implied by the question, but that's for the future. We're clearly not there yet. Yes.
Thank you very much. That's very, very interesting part. Another quick one is, I appreciate if you could briefly discuss the most important of the four-flowed responses. This sounds like this is going to take 5-10 minutes. So maybe we can skip, or you want to talk, you want to answer quickly?
Okay, with the doomsayers, the people who are saying it's the end of the world, I clearly don't think AI is the end of the world. It's a huge opportunity for humanity. The regulators are basically saying we just need a little bit more of what we already have. And I think from the talk you can see I don't agree with that. With the authoritarians, technology can clearly be used for authoritarian purposes. And I as a sort of Democrat and somebody who I find that frightening, that technology is sort of social credit systems that you find in some countries, they're alarming. And the accelerationists, that frankly seems irresponsible, just to basically throw the world to the technology companies and basically a sort of laissez-faire, let them do what they want. That just frankly seems irresponsible. So the four responses, I don't see value in any of the four responses, and that we need some alternative thoughts and ideas.
Okay, thank you very much. So now the time is actually approaching, but one final very quick question. Thank you for your presentation. I'm from Brazil. Recently, we had problems regarding social media using personal data. This led in that case to Twitter being banned in the country due to lack of legal representation. I believe this sheds light on the challenge of personal data protection internationally independent of laws in specific countries. Is there a way to enforce privacy and data ownership internationally?
Well, again, I mean, I think that was okay. Two things there. I mean, it's a beautiful question. Again, this like the problem of cross-border enforcement is the problem of enforcing these. But okay, very quickly, what I would say is that even in one country, before we even get to the problems of cross-border enforcement of data, even when we talk about a single country like Japan, I think there are enormous problems with enforcing these sorts of laws. Nation states often don't have the capacities or the resources to enforce these laws, and private enforcement, leaving it to individuals to enforce their rights in courts, that clearly doesn't work. That for various reasons I don't have time to talk about, but the two sort of classic models, state enforcement and private enforcement by individuals enforcing privacy rights, those two models of enforcement don't work. So I just wonder, it's a good question, and my answer is perhaps a rather cautious no. It's very difficult.
Thank you very much, Professor Fenwick. It was very exciting, and we had a lot of questions. Maybe we could talk 30 minutes or 1 hour more about this.
Yes.
I had many other actually questions, but it's the end of time.
Yes.
So thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much for your chairmanship of the session. It was very smooth, and thank you everyone for your participation, because I do appreciate it's a sort of hot, busy time of year. So thank you everyone.
ありがとうございました。Thank you very much. それではマイクを事務局にお返しいたします。
フェニック先生、田中先生、ありがとうございました。最後に事務局より3点ご案内させていただきます。まず、次回のブランバックセミナーのご案内です。次回は7月23日水曜日12時10分より、九州大学システム情報科学研究院情報学部門の金子美希准教授より、安全と健康を着るスマート衣服を活用した体調評価指標の開発と題し講演を実施いたします。詳細はホームページをご覧ください。